Okay, good afternoon. I'm going to present you the topic today, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Since you are not able to attend the class, I will then present and upload to the system, then you will then able to watch then after. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply, as you know, is the important part of the economics. Aggregate demand is the producer and aggregate demand is the consumer, and aggregate supply is the producer side. So-called, we are questioning the consumption and production, and the producer welfare and consumer welfare, or so-called the producer surplus, consumer surplus, or if you want to call producer gain and consumer welfare. In economics, as you are understanding, there are three key facts about economic fluctuations. The economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Fluctuations in the economy are often called the business cycle. These fluctuations do not follow regular, easily predictable patterns. We are observing here the short-run economic fluctuations between the 1960 to 2010, approximately the 40 to 50 years in the United States. As we are observing, the economic uh, is not but it's always increasing. The real GDP is improving, and the stagnation is not so big. Some small stagnation or fluctuation observed in the economy, but it is continuously increasing and developing, and started approximately from $3,000 and goes to 10,000, which is good economical progress from the $1 billion we are talking about. Three key facts about the economic fluctuations. The variables which is fluctuates together are mostly observed in the income. The production fluctuates closely together, and many macroeconomic variables fluctuates maybe with different amounts. When we are looking to the economical progress of the countries, we are looking to the GDP, progress of the GDP, or so-called gross domestic production, and the unemployment rate, and also the income, gross national income or per capita income in the country, which is more realistic approach for being able to understand the welfare. Therefore, when we are looking to the short-run economic fluctuations on the graphic, as you are observing, there are some stagnation in the economy, again from 60s to 2000. The investment spending is illustrated here, and as you are observing, it is somehow some years between 1970 to 80s, some stagnation and some reduction is observed. In 1980s, again, some reduction is observed and goes to the 19, again, improvements, and after 1995, the progress is observed until 2000, and after 2000, the millennium, some regressions and some reduction in the investment observed. The factors which is affecting and changing the economical progress is, as I said to you, the GDP and the unemployment. If the GDP is going, the output, so-called the production is increased, we are expecting that the unemployment reduce, or vice versa. When the output falls, then the unemployment is expected to increase. The change in the real GDP are inversely related, as you are observing, between output and unemployment. There is an inverse relationship. When the output increase and develop and enlarge, the unemployment rate is supposed to be reduced. During this time, there are some recessions. Unemployment is expected to increase, as I said to you, or the vice versa. During the progress, the unemployment rate is expected to reduced. Here, the unemployment rate is illustrated as you are observing from time to time some reductions observed from 1970s, and then after it goes up after the 1973 somehow it goes down again, and in 1975 it goes up to 1977, 8, and then it goes down again. There are some structural breaks, which is a strong reduction in the economy or in the unemployment is observed, but in generally, as you know, the natural rate of unemployment is around 6%, and this is somehow it goes some 10% in 80s, in 85s, and then goes down around 5% to 4% the unemployment rate, which is sometimes is a little bit strong reduction, and then after it goes up. The short-run economic fluctuations, as I said to you, is introduced to you, and most economists believes that the classical theory describes the world in the long run, but not in the short run. However, short-run effects is heavily affecting and changing the long run. Therefore, the political measures and applications and sanctions and the regulations are affecting heavily the economical development in the long run. If the quantity of money in the economy were to double, price will double, inflation will double, and so the income is expected also. The real variables will remain constant. These changes will not occur instantaneously. It takes time for prices and incomes to change, so it is not quickly responding. In the meantime, there can be a real effects. The resource transfer observed during this period, when there is a inflationary periods, some resources, some reasonable resources goes to the producer from the consumers. Therefore, welfare will decrease and producer gain is supposed to be increased, and this is so-called resource transfer from consumers to producers, which is not good. And as you are observing here, if we are in the equilibrium position at B, the resource transfer realized. Sorry, I have to check whether you are able to attend the class. Unfortunately, you are still not. Annie, you are in the course. Did you attend to my class? Are you in the course? Annie,
Yes, I am.
Okay, then why you colleagues not able to attend? Are you able to follow my slides?
Yes.
Why the other two not able to attend?
I don't know why.
Because I already added them, Sayed and Rahel already is in my list and they are not able to attend. What's the problem? Do you know any suggestion or did you communicate with them?
Don't know.
You
I
don't.
don't know.
Okay, then I'm going to my presentation again. You are able to follow, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm introducing the aggregate supply and aggregate demand and the producer again and the consumer surpluses. Here we are representing the equilibrium point at B, and as you are observing, when the economy is in the equilibrium, the producer surplus and consumer surplus is supposed to be equally distributed, which is never realized. We are not always in the equilibrium, and always we are having some problems, and the consumer surplus or welfare is reduced because of the price increase and inflation, and the producer gain is always becomes sometimes much better than the consumer surplus. Here we are supposing the market price for the wheat, so-called the cereals, is increased, and results of this increase, as you observe, the price goes from P to P dash, and as you observe, the welfare from the ABC, which is the consumer welfare, is reduced to A, and the producer welfare is increased to the D plus B, and E and C are supposed to be debt weights, which is somehow not good for the economics, and some if there is any taxation or these things, then is probably distributed to the economy. Therefore, the welfare increase or decrease dependent to the price changes. If the price goes up, the producer gain is increased and consumer welfare is supposed to be reduced. As you're observing here, it goes to the A, the triangle, the right angle triangle is the reduction, because before this price increase, when the price at P level is realized, the consumer welfare is A, B, C, but after this, when the price increase realized, then the consumer welfare is reduced to A, and the producer welfare is increased to D plus B, and E also included. And when we are going to consider these taxations, which we don't have here, this will be then later introduced to you. The taxation will then, which is the captured and collected by the government, then will introduce you later. But here you are observing the producer gain is increased from D, A to D, E, B, C, and somehow the other triangle, and the consumer welfare is reduced from A, B, C to only A, which is not good for the economy because general welfare is reduced. The model of aggregate demand and the aggregate supply is going to be introduced to you in the following slides. Now we are on the definitions and the introduction to you, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. The two variables used to develop the model, as I said to you, in the short-term fluctuations, the output of the goods and services measured by the real GDP, and the CPI, so-called the consumer price index, the level of prices, also called the rise of the general price in the economy, is affecting and changing the welfare. Therefore, aggregate demand and aggregate supply heavily affected from this GDP and CPI changes. When the GDP is increased, so-called the Y, the output, then the supply is going to enlarge and increase. And when the CPI, so-called the consumer price index, and the rising the general prices observed in the economy, this will then cause some welfare loss for the consumers. The short-run production, as it applies to businesses, state that at a certain point in the future, one or more inputs will be fixed while others are variable. In the short run, as I said to you, this one variable should be in the constant position, in the fixed position. And when it really relates to economics, the short run speaks to the idea that an economy behaves will vary based on how much time it has to be absorbed and react to stimuli. The short run counterparts is the long run, as you know, and the short run is for the 1 year, and the long run is more than 1 year, 5 year, 10 years, and the mid is also medium as approximately 3 to 5 years. Therefore, we will then exercise these things in the following lessons. The short run counterparts is the long run, as I said to you, which contains no fixed cost. At least more than one variable is going to be changed. Therefore, cost balance out with the desired amount of cost available at the lowest possible prices is expected. The model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply is maintained, and economists use the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply to explain the short run and also long run fluctuations in the economy. The aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the long run, however, is differently responding. The aggregate supply is not very effectively change and react to these prices in the long run, but in the short run, it is effectively affected and changed. As you are observing here, the aggregate demand and supply is changing, and here the aggregate supply curve is illustrated here. The activities dependent to the time is given, and the business cycle, as you are observing, somehow is increasingly developed in this given graph. The aggregate demand curve shows the quantity of goods and services that households, firms, and the government want to buy at each price level. And the aggregate supply curve shows the quantity of goods and services that firms choose to produce and sell at each price level. Are you able to follow me, any? If you have any question, you will ask me. Is that okay? Any? Do you hear me?
Yes.
Do
Yes.
you hear me? Do you want any question? Do you have any question? Do you want to ask anything?
No, I
Okay,
don't
then.
have. But you speak quickly, very quickly.
You want me to speak slowly?
Yeah.
Okay, then. Okay, you up to here. If you have any question, you will ask. If not, then I will go further. The
Yeah.
aggregate demand curve, as you know, is the demand which is in the aggregate level. Aggregate means is the total, is the generally the all demands which is collected from all members, all consumers. The aggregate supply is then, of course, the producers, the produce the economical consumption, economically goods and services to the whole economy, the aggregate supply curve, isn't it? The quantity of goods and goods and services which is produced in a year is the GDP, and aggregate supply is then the amount of these goods and services which is produced in the economy. And aggregate supply is the demand of these goods and services. This is then the total amount, not the singular, not for the individual, not for the firm, but for the whole firms, but the whole consumers, for the whole demand. Okay? Here we are illustrating
Yeah.
the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. You know deciding these things because you are in the master class, isn't it? You know the supply and demand curves. And here we are illustrating similarly the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves together, which is in the equilibrium. The quantity output is in the x-axis and the price level is at the y-axis. And as you are observing, if the price change is realized, some changes on the aggregate supply and aggregate demand curve is also expected. We are going to start with the aggregate demand curve. I'm going to introduce you the aggregate demand, and then we will go through to the supply, aggregate supply. The aggregate demand is made up of households or consumer spending, so-called, this is then the components of the GDP, business investment, government spending, and the net export. It is about the spending decisions of households, firms, and government. This is the aggregate demand. Is demanded from the investment, from the government, from the exporters to realize some activities, economical activities. The aggregate demand curve is also realized with the GDP components, is also illustrated with the components of the GDP. And this is then, of course, interpreted as y is equal to c plus I plus g plus nx. Y here is the output as it is in the former slide mentioned. C is the consumption. I is the investment. G is the governmental spending or expenditures. And the NX is the net export. Net export means total export will be subtracted from the total import. And if there is any positive number, we say we have the net export positive. If there is a negative, then we call this as a deficit, or the negative or trade balance is in negative. Okay, the components of the GDP, as mentioned before, is y is equal to c plus g plus I plus nx. And these are output, consumption, governmental spending, and net export. Export minus import is also here on this slide, is represented and illustrated. The model will attempt to capture the essence or the most important features of the process, and the economic decisions that will consider will involve static and intertemporal choices. Here, the aggregate demand curve is only represented and illustrated. And as you are observing here, there is some decrease on the prices. And when the demand is expected to enlarge, we have to reduce the prices, or vice versa. When the price is decreased, then we are going to enlarge the demand. This is for you also same. When the discount or seasonal discount is realized in the economy or in the market, you enjoy to shop, isn't it, Annie? Am I right? You shop more. But if it is opposite, then
Yes.
you reduce your shop. Due to this reason, demand is also representing the welfare for the consumers. And when the price is reduced, we all enjoy to enlarge our welfare. This means the consumer welfare is expected to enlarge from P1 to P2. And because of this, if you combine these blue lines to the price and to the quantity output, you will get this red right angle triangle. And as you are observing this triangle, as much as the price goes down, this triangle will enlarge, and this will then increase the consumer welfare, or vice versa. Opposite is also correct. If the price is going up, then this will then reduce the consumer welfare. The consumers will suffer, isn't it? Due to this reason, then we have to balance these things with the producer, because producer side is also in the opposite side. Producer are concentrated to the profit, and if this price is continuously reduced, the production will not realize sufficiently, because cheap and lower prices will not let the producer to maintain and enlarge their goods and services. Due to this reason, we have to find in the economy a reasonable prices, that we call this the equilibrium price or the market price, to maintain this production and consumption together. Okay. Okay, the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. As you observe, the curve here is downward sloping, is negatively sloped, because when you are subtracting, because the slope here is, when you want to learn the slope of this curve, then you have to subtract from P2 minus P1 and y2 minus y1. When you are subtracting y2 minus y1 is a positive number, but when you are subtracting the price P2 minus P1, which is P2 is lower price, is a small number, let's say it is 6, and the price 1 or P1 is, let's say, 4, then 6 minus 4 is going to be, of course, P2 is now 4, then 4 minus 6 is going to be minus 2, and for y2 minus y1, if it is, let's say, y2 is 8 and y1 is, let's say, 4 again, then you have here 4 some numbers, then 2 divided to minus 2 divided to 4 will give you 1 over 2, which is 0.5. Then slope of this curve is minus 0.5. And as you are observing, then some numbers is negative. This gives negative relationship between price and quantity. Due to this reason, we are understanding the demand curve is negatively related with the prices and the quantity. And due to this reason, price increase negatively affect the output, and price decrease positively affect the output. Sorry, price increase positively affect the consumer. Price increase negatively affect the consumer's demand or the output, and the price increase is the vice versa, negatively affects, because when you are increasing the prices, the consumption is going to be reduced. The aggregate demand and the curve, as I said to you, is downward sloping and the negatively related, and the price level and the consumption is also indicate the wealth effect, because as much as you are increasing the prices, the consumption will reduce, and this will then cause some wealth reduction. And the price effect and investment, the interest rate effects is also similarly realized, because as much as the price is going up, which is the inflation and the interest rate must be parallelly realized. And when this is realized, then the interest rate is going up also, and this will then reduce the investment in the coming season. And price level and the net export is also parallelly same. The price increase has also meant the depreciation of the currency. It is reducing the value of the currency, because price increase has also meant the enlargement of the money supply. And when money supply is enlarged, is then the indication of the depreciation or the lowering the value of the price. And when the price value is reduced, this will then affect an exchange rate the foreign currencies will become appreciated. Therefore, there is inverse relationship between these all. When we are going to step by step explaining these effects, let's see how it is realized. This can be also illustrated with the graphic, but here I didn't put it. We will learn later. The wealth effect, a lower price level rises the real value of money and make consumers wealthier, isn't it? As I mentioned to you, or vice versa. If the price going up, then the consumption will reduce. And the increase in the consumer spending means larger quantities of goods and services demanded. This is how it is realized, the lower prices. Because we all enjoy to shop when the price is going down. We go to shop, especially in the seasonal discounts, because they are reducing somehow 50%, 70% so-called, which is not always realistic. They are increasing the prices and reducing again, and this will then cause some, let's say, imaginary effect that you are buying some cheap products, and this is then enlarge and increase the shop. Due to this reason, this price effect is very important for the consumer or the consumption. And when we are looking to the interest rate, as I said to you, the interest rate is also affected from the prices, because rising the prices has also meant the inflation. And when the inflation is high, inflation rate and the nominal interest rate, only the nominal interest rate, must be parallelly realized. If not, then is problem. If this is realized, then it is of course problem for the investors, because if the interest rate going up, if think about the y-axis is the interest rate, and on the lower x-axis there is the loanable funds. And if the interest rate is going up for the demand, there again, when you are thinking the demand curve, it will reduce the demand of this money, because nobody want to buy with higher interest rate. You don't get any credit if the interest is high, isn't it? If there is a 20% interest, you scared to buy some, let's say, borrow some credit. But when the interest rate is 1% maybe, or 2% or 3%, you will enjoy to get some credit, because you can pay back easily, because the interest rate is not too high. And the exchange rate, as I said to you, the lower the price level in the United States causes the interest rate to fall, and the real exchange rate depreciates, which stimulates the net export. This is somehow in the economics, the exchange rate is connected here to the net export, and increase the net export spending means larger quantity of goods and services demanded. But on the other side, as I mentioned to you, the exchange rate is also affected if the higher prices in the economy realize. And when the higher prices realize in the economy, this will cause some negative effects on the foreign currencies, which is here, as you see, for the United States dollar is somehow a depreciation, but in the foreign currencies, for the other countries' currencies, if there is an inflation in the market, this will cause some appreciation of the currency, because this is the book for the United States, for the American students. But for our countries, as I said to you, if the let's say Naira, are you coming from Nigeria?
No, I'm from Congo.
Congo, you are using dollar, isn't it? Congo dollar.
Yes.
Therefore, if your Congo dollar is somehow increase the prices in the market, you need more Congo dollar to buy some products, which means your currency is depreciating, isn't it? Your value is reduced. But for the foreigners, is opposite, because you will not able to buy US dollar or euro, because euro will become expensive for you. Due to this reason, this is also a problem for your economy. As a, let's say, foreigners, some people will enjoy to buy your products for a period of time, but some people will not, because after then you will require more dollar to buy some energy. If you are buying some foreign inputs to produce, then this will then cause again problem to your economy. Therefore, inflationary measures and inflationary economical aspects is not always good for the economy. It is always damaging your, let's say, net export. The aggregate demand curve shifts. The downward slope of the aggregate demand curve shows that a fall in price level rises the overall quantity of goods and services demanded, and many other factors, however, affect the quantity of goods and services demanded at any given price level. When one of these factors or changes, the aggregate demand curve shifts, as you are understanding, whether the price changes or the income or other things will affect and change, isn't it? Because it is already affected. Your wages, when your salaries change, your demand is affected. Your income, when changes, increase or decrease, is affected. The demand curve is affected. Or the price changes, increase or decrease on the demand curve, is affecting your demand capacity, because I show you on the graphic, as the prices goes up, your consumption will reduce, or vice versa. Why the aggregate demand curve might shift, as I said to you, arise from changes in consumption, investment. This is in the governmental level now we are thinking, the governmental purchases and net exports. If it is positive or negative, these are all affecting. If the consumption habits increase and enlarge, then this will then affect and change the aggregate demand. The investment, similarly, if you increase the investment and enlarge the goods and services, the aggregate demand is supposed to be also enlarged, because you will have more goods and services to buy. Therefore, the price probably will enlarge, as in summer, when the watermelon season comes in summer, you'd buy cheaper watermelon or melon, but in winter, which is not the season, the price going up, isn't it? Therefore, you may think in such a simplest application, and then you will understand how it is affecting this economy. The government purchases, also the public consumptions and expenditures and purchasing is also affecting the economy very heavily, and the aggregate demand shifts. And the net export also, exportable goods and the imports together, if it is positive number, some net exports gives us, then it is good for the economy. It is enlarging the economy, and the demand is expected to develop. And if it is negatively, then this will then cause some reduction. These things, these let's say parameters affecting and changing the aggregate demand. As you are observing here, we suppose that the price stay intact, but the output enlarge. And as you see, the output goes from Y1 to Y2, and if the price stay intact, then the aggregate demand curve moves from D1 to D2. This is so simple, but when you are observing, this is not such easily realized. But let's think about the ceteris paribus. Only the output is changed, and the other parameters stay intact without changing, constant. Then this is happen. Then this shift cause some aggregate demand curve to the upward position. Here I have some summarized explanation for you for being able to understand the wealth effect. I'm talking about the aggregate demand curve slopes downward because it has the wealth effect that I have explained to you. It has the interest rate effects, and it has the exchange rate effect. These three I have already mentioned. And why might the aggregate demand curve shifts, then is also possibly answered. It causes because the shifts are rising from the consumption, which I have mentioned to you, the consumption, investment, governmental purchases, and net export. And I'm going to give you the written brief description. And in event that makes consumers spend more at a given price level, which is a consumption increase, a tax cut, or some stock market booms, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. An event that makes consumers spending less at a given price level, a tax hike, stock market decline, and shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. As I mentioned to you, ceteris paribus, nothing changed. And shifts are rising from investment if the investment is boom. An event that makes firms invest more at a given price level, optimism about the future. People expect that the investment is realized, economy will enlarge and doing well. and fall in the interest rate is expected because of this, and due to an increase in the money supply, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and even that makes firms invest less at a given price level. Pessimism about the future, a rise in the interest rate is expected, or somehow speculative approach. Due to this, then expectations, decrease in the money supply and shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left is expected. And shifts arising from government purchases, an increase in government purchases of goods and services, greater spending on defense or highway constructions, shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, decrease in government purchases on goods and services, a cutback in the defense or highway spending shifts aggregate demand curve to the left, sorry. And the last one, the shift arising from the net export, and even that arises spending on the net export at a given price level, at a boom overseas speculation that causes an exchange rate depreciation, shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right, and even that reduces spending on the net exports at a given price level, a recession overseas speculation that causes an exchange rate appreciation shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left. As I said to you, I represented and illustrated to the right in the enlargement, and there is also to the left in the negative case, in the opposite cases. Now we came to the aggregate supply curve. We have already introduced you the aggregate demand curve. I will jump to the aggregate supply, then we will combine this together. Do you have any question, any?
No, I don't have.
Okay, so you are the only participant, I think, this class. I don't know why the other one didn't come, because the one came to my office and told me that he wants me to add him to the class. I already add him to the class, but he was in the Microsoft Teams, but didn't attend. I don't understand why. Do you have an idea? You didn't communicate with these people, because this is very interesting. Since they are wishing to join this masterclass, they must able to join. Do you have my
Yeah.
mobile? Did you get my mobile?
Yes, I have it. Yes, I have
Okay.
it.
Whenever you have problem or whenever you have communicate with them, let me know if they are exercising or experiencing any internet access or internet problem. I have to know, otherwise these absenteeism will cause them to fail this class, because it is online class and I am presenting them online, and I have to communicate with them comprehensively whenever they have problems, and when they not able to understand the class, I have to explain them. If they don't come to the class, how I am going to communicate and how I am going to know that they are learning or they are not learning, or whatever it is. Anyway, let's go to the second part. The aggregate supply curve is the other parties, is the suppliers, is the producers, and it is, of course, as you are understanding, aggregate supply and the production is dependent to the profit. As much as we are increasing now the prices, we are expecting that the production will enlarge, isn't it? In the demand side, we are expecting the price to fall down and the welfare is increased, the consumption will become higher. But here is opposite, is expected. Let me check if the class is in record, because I have to upload. Okay, it is continuing. Fine. In the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical because the price level does not affect the long run determinants of the real GDP. As I mentioned to you, it is only in the short run effective. Therefore, in the long run, we have a vertical line to the y-axis, and due to this reason, the aggregate supply curve is not affected from the price changes. But in the short run, the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping and is heavily affected from the price changes. Due to this reason, in the aggregate supply curve, we are expecting some increase and some enlargement in the employment either. Because we are enlarging the aggregate supply, we are increasing the prices, and results of this increase, the producer will profit and they have the spaces to enlarge and increase their capacity, and they employ some more employee. Therefore, aggregate supply curve is dependent to the price changes. The aggregate supply curve in the long run, an economy's production of goods and services depends on its supplies of labor, capital, and the natural resources, and on the available technology used to turn these factors of production to the goods and services. The price level does not affect the variables in the long run, as I said, but in the short run, it is effective. The long run aggregate supply curve represents the classical dichotomy and monetary neutrality, which is going to be introduced later. As you see, in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is not affected because the price changes reduced from P1 to P2, but the supply is stay intact at the neutral rate of output. The change in the price level in the first is not effective, and the aggregate supply curve does not change, and these price changes does not affect the quantity of goods and services supplied in the long run, as I said to you, because this is only effective in the short run. The long run aggregate supply curve is vertical, the natural rate of output, so-called, which is the production of goods and services that an economy achieves in the long run when unemployment is at its normal rate. The level of production is also referred to as potential output or full employment output. The natural rate of output is level of output towards which the economy gravitates in the long run. Why the long run aggregate supply curve might shift is a question. What shifts the curve to the right or to the left? A change in the economy or any change in the economy alters the natural rate of output and shifts the long run aggregate supply curve. The shifts may be categorized according to the various factors in the classical model that affects output. As you see here, the shifts might be realized because labor is changed, because capital is changed, because natural resources change, or because technological availability is increased or decreased, which is supposed to be human resources going to the upper level, so-called know-how, will affect and change results of this technology. And in the production function, these are all given because you are understanding why is the supply or aggregate supply or output is affected from the A. A is the available technology, is the function of the capital labor, human resources, and the natural resources. This is then the production function we are using always for developing model, and we are always using only the capital and labor and human resources and natural resources excluded because they are always somehow a fixed term and you are not able to change it easily. Here it is given a graphic to you, and the long run growth and inflation is illustrated here. As you are observing, the position start from the 1980s. In the long run, the curve is affected from the capital, labor, and the human resources or technological progress. And results of this, a long run shifts in the aggregate supply is realized. And when this has happened, a growth in the money supply, results of consumption, investment, export, or governmental expenditures is shifting the demand curve, the aggregate demand curve, so-called, from the blue lines is shifted to the dark brown, the vertical line, and the aggregate demand curve, as you are observing, is the inverse relationship curve. The aggregate demand in the 80s is going to be shifts results of this supply and aggregate demand, which is affecting and changing together bilaterally to the economy from 1980s price to 1990 price. And when this all happens, this will then shift the economy to the upper price level, and this will then create another shifts and another progress in the aggregate demand. And the aggregate demand when shifted, then this then cause some supply curve enlargement. And at P2000, as you are observing from 80 to 90, from 90 to 2000 year, the price affects and change also the economy, and the output is also shifted from 90s to from 80s to 90, and from 90s to 2000, and realized at the last intersection between aggregate demand curve for 2000 and aggregate supply curve for 2000, where the P2000 is intersecting these two curves. Using aggregate demand and aggregate supply to deficit long-run growth and inflation, the most important forces that govern the economy and growth in the long run are the technology and monetary policies. As you are understanding, technological improvements and development always fostering the economy, and monetary capacity, so-called the capital ability of the country, will then cause some shifts and increase in the economy, because if you don't have capital, no resources, you are not able to develop your economy. Because of this reason, we are always getting some financial, let's say, FDI, foreign direct investments, foreign portfolio investments from the current foreign countries, or we are borrowing some other intermediaries or institutions for enlarging our economies, because money talks, and money is a problem always in the economy. If you don't have financial ability, you are not able to develop your economy. But on the other side, when you are having this financial ability and you don't have the technology, you are not able to progress your economy. You are not able to develop your economical capacity and reaching and capturing or catch up the welfare countries, or so-called the developed nations. The short-term fluctuations in the output and the price level should be viewed as deviations from the continuing long-run trends of outputs, growth, and inflation. In the short run, when we are looking up, an increase in the overall price level, the economy tends to raise the quantity of goods and services supplied. A decrease in the level of price tends to reduce the quantity of goods and services supplied. As a result, the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. As it is illustrated here, when the price fall down, then the supply is also fall down, or vice versa. When the price go up, and the aggregate supply is expected to up. You got it. A decrease in the price level will shift the aggregate supply to the lower level from Y1 to Y2, and the vice versa, the opposite case. When the price is increased, it is expected also that the output will also increase in the short run. In the long run, it is a vertical line to the parallel price level, and this will not become effective when the price changes becomes in the market, or when the price increase in the market or decrease. This will not affect and change the economy. But as I mentioned to you, some other factors, the investment and some other employees and in the other governmental purchases must be moved and changed, and then this will then affect and change the economy even. Sometimes these price changes is not effective because of the sticky wages theory, because of the sticky price theory, and because of the misperceptions theory. These are the theories which is not affecting, or which is somehow reducing the movements of the economy and stagnating, and causing some slowness and slowdown of the economy. The sticky wage theory suggests the nominal wages are slow because it is not adjusted as much as the price changes. As you know, the price going very quickly up, but our salaries are not very high, are not catch up this price increase, isn't it? Any? Am I right? Your salaries, are you working?
Yes.
Do you work?
Oh no.
Are you don't work? But you know, from your father, the price is always going faster than our wages, than our salaries, isn't it? Therefore, this is because this is not easily adjusted. The unions, the labor unions, or the governments are always heavily adjusting these price changes. The inflation always fostering the economy, but the wages are lowering, and this is then somehow sticky wages. The wages are always very slowly changes because the bosses, the employers are not ready to change it very quickly. The nominal wages do not adjust immediately to a fall in the price level or too higher in the price level. A lower price level makes employment and production less profitable. Therefore, vice versa is also possible. This induces firms to reduce the quantity of goods and services supplied, or the opposite is also possible. This will then, if the price is going up, then this will then increase and enlarge the goods and services, but the wages are not very quickly adapted. The sticky price theory is also similarly to the wages. Prices of some goods and services adjust sluggishly in response to changing economic conditions. An unexpected fall in the price level leaves some firms with higher than desired prices. For a variety of reasons, they may not want to or be able to change prices immediately. This depresses sales, which induces firms to reduce the quantity of goods and services they produce. The misperception theory: changes in the overall price level temporarily misleads suppliers because what is happening in the market is somehow questionable, in which they sell their products. A lower price level causes misperceptions about their relative prices, and these misperceptions induce suppliers to decrease the quantity of goods and services supplied because they are not able to understand what's going on in the market. Sometimes some misleading actions or speculations affecting and changing this production, as sometimes happens. That's the reason then the price is going sometimes very high, and sometimes the price is going down, and sometimes we don't have some goods or products to buy because of these misleading speculations and affecting and changing the market. The prices is very heavily increased, or sometimes it is very cheap, and the products becoming very abundantly in the market, and this is also not good because it is in both cases affecting and changing the economy and causing some stagnation. All these theories, all these three theories suggest that output deviates in the short run from the natural rate when the actual price level deviates from the price level that people had expected to prevail or maintain in the market. The quantity or output supplied is supposed to be equal to the natural rate of output plus a actual price level minus expected price level. Therefore, this is then the simplest illustration for observing this impact. Shifts sometimes, as I mentioned to you, arise from changes in the expected price level, in labor, in capital, natural resources, and technology. These are all the somehow the factors of, let's say, production, or the production function is somehow is included results of these parameters. An increase in the expected price level reduces the quantity of goods and services supplied, and shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. A decrease in the expected price level rises the quantity of goods and services supplied and shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. Either or vice versa, again, the opposite case is introduced to you. And when we are looking to the short-run aggregate supply curve as a summary, why does short run aggregate supply curve slope upward? Um, Let me check. Somebody is asking something. Okay. Why might the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts? As I said to you, first the aggregate supply curve slope is upward because of the sticky wages theory, sticky price theory, and misperceptions theory. And the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts arises from labor, from capital, from natural resources, from technology, and from expected price level. From labor, because an increase in the quantity of labor available, perhaps due to a fall in the natural rate of unemployment, shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right. A decrease in the quantity of labor available, perhaps due to a rise in the natural rate of unemployment, shifts the aggregate supply curve to the left. And the capital, an increase in the physical or human capital, shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right, or a decrease in the physical or human capital shifts the aggregate supply curve to the left. And the natural resources, an increase in the available natural resources, shift the aggregate supply curve to the right. A decrease in the availability of natural resources shift the aggregate supply curve to the left. And the technology, advance in the technological knowledge shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right. A decrease in the available technology, perhaps due to a government regulation, shifts the aggregate supply curve to the left. And the expected price level, a decrease in the expected price level shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right. And increase in the expected price level shifts the short-run aggregate supply curve to the left. Here it is given the long run and the short run. As you are observing, the aggregate demand curve in the long run, in the short run is in the same direction, in the same position, but short run aggregate supply curve is increasingly parallel and proportionally with the price changes. But in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is ineffective and stay intact to the price changes, and it is a vertical line. Therefore, as you are observing from this graphic, the natural rate of output is always causing this intact position or stable and constant position of the long run aggregate supply curve. But in the short run, it is effectively changed and developed as much as the price changes. And we are always creating short run policies and short run government, let's say, regulations, which is proposed and planned for employing some employee to the economy and to get some more voters. But in the long run, this will then, of course, if the economy is not doing well, will be then dismissed, released from the job places. But the politicians always using these political games for increasing their votes. They are increasing the prices, employing some people, and then when they are getting the positions, they don't care what's happening to the people. And results of this, in a year or in 2 years, people will then become unemployed. Therefore, this kind of short plans and programs are not very good for the economy, and it is not performing a stable economy policy. The economic fluctuations is analyzed below given, determine whether the event affects the aggregate supply and aggregate demand first. For being able to analyze this fluctuation, you have to determine the effects of this event, these cases, what causes this aggregate supply and aggregate demand shifts. Then decide the direction of the curves, whether it is going upward to the higher or to the downward. You have to determine what is the impact of this fluctuation or price changes or somehow other political impact. Use a diagram for comparing this initial and the new equilibrium for being able to compare and interpret, and keep track of the short and long run equilibrium for being able to transition between them and then inform the necessary people about the performance of the economy. In the short run, shifts in the aggregates demand causes fluctuations, as I mentioned to you. In the economy's output, goods and services will be fluctuates together. But in the long run, shifts in the aggregate demand affects the overall price, but do not affect the goods and services which is produced. It is stay intact, but the price changes is effective. Therefore, in the long run, this kind of games and this time of political applications or the inflationary measures are not doing good to the economy. And the policymakers who influence aggregate demand can potentially mitigate or reduce the severity of economic fluctuations. That's the reason. As you are observing here, contraction in aggregate demand is illustrated here. In the first case, we are supposing a decrease in the aggregate demand curve is realized. It moves from the blue demand, aggregate demand 1, to the aggregate demand, the brown one, aggregate demand 2 to the down to the brown colored line, and it is reduced. And results of this, it is expected that this causes output to fall in the short run because aggregate demand is reduced. And when the demand is less, then you are not going to produce more, isn't it? Therefore, this causes some reduction in the output, and this is then the short run effect. When this has happened, then it is expected over time the short run aggregate supply curve shifts. And as you see, the aggregate supply curve shifts also from aggregate supply curve blue line from the AS1 to the AS2 to the aggregate supply curve to the second one to the 2 in the brown one. And as you are observing results of this all, then the output will return its natural position at point C, because as you see, it moves first from B and then goes to A and then it goes to C, where the natural rate is realized. And this is then the long run effect because it is not changing the economy, because as I said to you, in the long run, in the short run, maybe it is making some deviation in the economy, it is making some circulation in the economy, causing some impact to the economy. But in the long run, as you see, the P1 goes to P2, P2 goes to P3, but it is becoming and not affecting, not becoming effective on the long run aggregate supply curve, but it is somehow enlarging the demand and causing some changes. Do you have any question? It moves from A to C, isn't it? Is it fine for you? Okay. And the considered model in the aggregate supply, decrease in one of the determinants of aggregate supply shifts the curve to the left, as I mentioned to you. The output falls below the natural rate of employment, and unemployment rises, and the price level is also expected to rise. Here again is given the aggregate demand curve is supposed to be same, but the price changes, which is increased, is supposed to be becomes effective on the aggregate supply curve and shift the aggregate supply curve in the short run from AS1 to AS2. This is an adverse shift in the short run aggregate supply curve, and this causes some output fall. As you observe here, it goes from A to B, results of this price increase. And when this is happen, then we are expecting that the long run effect stay intact, but the short run effect is causing some price increase to the economy and shift the aggregate demand to the B, from A to B. And the aggregate supply is reduced, as you are observing, because of this price changes, because of these higher prices. The effects of these shifts in the aggregate supply, the adverse shifts in aggregate supply causes stagflation. Stagflation, if you don't know, it is the unemployment and price both increase. In Phillips, it is the opposite. If you don't know the Phillips curve, you may look after this class. In Phillips curve, there is an inverse proportional relationship between the price and the unemployment in the short run, of course. When the price is going up, it is expected that, and according to the Phillips, the unemployment rate will be reduced. But here in the stagflation, the unemployment and the price both is realized, which is not expected, which is not normal conditions. The period of recession and inflation, this is supposed to be realized because there is a recession and inflation is also there. This is stagflation. You have also a recession, the demand is decreasing, nobody buy, but still this reduction in the demand, the price going up, maybe because of the supply is less, as in the pandemic. Do you remember the pandemic period? There was a supply chain. They blocked the supply chain from China, from other countries, from the emerging economies who's distributing to the world. The economy is closed, the transport and everything closed. And result of this transport, uh, even the toilet papers became very expensive, isn't it? Therefore, this is then somehow happens in the extraordinary positions or extraordinary cases or situations, like in the pandemic, isn't it? Do you remember? The toilet papers and the papers, handkerchiefs, and these things are become very expensive at that period. But this is not because of the supply enlarged, but because of the reduction, because of the recession. Demand is not increased, but the economy is in recession, but the prices going up because nobody able to find the necessary products that they need. The output falls and the price rise. Policymakers who can influence aggregate demand cannot offset both of these adverse effects simultaneously. Policy response to recession. Policymakers may respond to a recession in one of the followings: do nothing and wait for the prices and wages to adjust itself, or take action to increase the aggregate demand by using monetary and fiscal policies, which is more, let's say, uh, financial regulations required. We may use some open market operations, the expansionary money policy, buying bonds, reducing tax to increase incomes. These kind of things can be done for regulating the economy or for activating the economy, because you have to increase either the income or enlarge the wages, or reducing the tax for increasing their incomes, or buying bonds for pump up the money to the bank, to the markets. These things will be used for making some regulations. Or you just do nothing, you wait to see what will happen to the prices and to the wages, whether they are able to adjust their self with their own let's say circulation, with their own capacity, which is sometimes not realized. Here again, it is given the aggregate supply shifts. In the first position, we suppose there's a short-term aggregate supply falls. It moves from the aggregate supply 1 to aggregate supply 2. In the second position, results of this, the policymakers can accommodate the shift by expanding aggregate demand. And results of this, aggregate demand curve moves from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2 to the brown one. And when this has happened, then this will then expect the price level will rise from P1 to P2 to P3. And when this is all happens, we are expecting that the output will fall its natural rate, and it is regulating again economy to the where the natural rate of output is realized. Therefore, as you see, either you are interrupting and intervene to the market or not, the natural output rate will be regulating itself, or you do this to accelerate these movements for bringing the market to the desired position, because sometimes some regulations and some interventions to the market is required. And we came to the end of our presentation and end of our class. I will summarize quickly to the class, very short, brief introduction again. All societies experience short-run economic fluctuations around the long-run trends, as you understand from this class. These fluctuations are irregular, largely unpredictable. When recessions occur, real GDP and other measures of income, spending, and production falls, and unemployment rises. And classical economy theory is based on the assumption that nominal variables do not influence real variables. Most economists believe that this is an accurate assumption in the long run, but not in the short run. The economists analyze short-run economic fluctuations using the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. According to this model, the output of goods and services and the overall level of prices and adjust to balance aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And the aggregate demand curve slopes downward for three reasons: the wealth effect and increased interest rate effects and exchange rate effect. Any event or policy that changes consumption, investment, government purchases, or net export at a given price level will shift the aggregate demand curve. And in the long run, the aggregate supply curve is vertical. In the short run, the aggregate supply curve is upward. And there are three theories explaining the upward slope of the short-run aggregate side. These are the sticky wages theory, sticky price theory, and the misperception theory. They alter the economy's ability to produce output. Even some cases will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. The position of the short-run aggregate supply curve depends on the expected price level. And one possible cause of economic fluctuations is a shift in the aggregate demand. A second possible of the economic fluctuation is shift in the aggregate supply, and the stagflation is a period of falling output and rising the prices, which is mostly observed in the extraordinary positions like in the pandemic. Do you have any question for this class? Miss Annie, do you have any? Is okay?
Yeah.
Next week we will meet again and we will go through to the next chapter. I will upload this video and the PowerPoints also, then you will study. I will give the PDF also, the book, maybe some chapters to study. You understand?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then see you then next week, and please let me know what is happening to your friends, why they didn't attend to the class, because it is strange. They please let me know. Okay, let them to communicate with me. Have a nice weekend. Goodbye. Bye bye.